Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, and we all doff a cap as Queen Victoria there makes her tour around the park and leaving road apples behind. It is Victoria Day weekend, and let us not forget that. And in this part of the world, of course, all kinds of angst and anger and outrage and whatever banging on the desks because Bob Hepburn at the Toronto Star insinuated that it was time to forget about Queen Victoria. We'll call it something else, like Prime Minister's Day, which I can imagine everyone would embrace. But, you know, considering this is a show about politics at Queen's Park, many of us are unaware, forget, or whatever, are ignorant of the fact that Queen's Park's kind of named after Victoria. So we're pleased to be joined by the Queen's Park Bureau Chief at CTV, Colin DeMello. Good morning. How are y'all?
Good. Excellent.
Great. Happy to be here.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that we want to somehow forget about the history of, Queen Victoria, et cetera. And I think Colin just put you on the spot, but a lot of people don't realize that she sits on the south end of the park there, and that statue looking south towards the Hospital Row and everything else. She plays a rather prominent role, but a lot of people probably don't even realize she's sitting there.
Yeah, in fact, I can actually see her from my office when I look out. And recently I brought my kids down to Queen's Park to kind of just take a look at the cherry blossoms that have been gifted to Ontario years and years ago. And we took a picture by Queen Victoria. I mean, you know, it is a really prominent statue in the south end of Queen's Park. And I would say that this progressive conservative government would probably defend her honor till their dying day. In fact, there's a school in Parkdale named after Queen Victoria that the school is looking to change the name. And one of the government MPPs, David Piccini, recently tweeted that it was cancel culture. Another example of cancel culture to kind of get rid of her name from that school. So, you know, at least you know where the progressive conservatives stand, because they actually brought in God Save the Queen. That's, sung in the legislature, probably very poorly, but sung in the legislature about once a month. So they are steadfast in their support of the monarchy. And, no one in this government would ever be willing to strip Queen Victoria's name from anything.
Well, if just as an aside, I would wish that we could cancel culture, the phrase itself. I'm getting so fed up with that. It just becomes this, this is a whole question around our history. And to your point, I'm glad, good on you to kind of bring the kids down there and kind of show them what it meant. But Keith, we were talking on the radio this week, and, what else would we call it? And somebody said, well, it's the May 2-4 weekend. In your part of the world, they have no idea what we're talking about when they say May 2-4. It's the long May weekend, or it's the Victoria Day weekend, but what the hell's this 2-4 thing?
Exactly. That's a case, by the way.
Exactly.
This is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, Queen's Park is Queen Victoria. Rightly so. Her statue is the most prominent on the front lawn of the legislature for good reason. Perhaps it's time that, our education curricula were expanded to really teach about what went on under Queen Victoria's reign, under Sir John A.'s government. It's time to address these issues, but addressing them by renaming the holiday or getting rid of statues or something, it just seems to me as extreme. Let's all get better educated about what's gone on, but let's, back off on I won't use the phrase that's driving Dave nuts, but, Vicky was known for a good time girl. So let's look at it as, it's a holiday time. It's Queen Victoria's Day. Let's just leave it at that, please.
Well, John, in some respects, and I know you're steeped in the history of this country in many respects, and particularly your involvement with the RCAF and all that kind of thing. But when we get into looking at her role, and it was remarked, there's no other country in the world that marks Victoria Day. Well, that's probably because not a lot of countries were born during her reign. This one was, right? I mean, it happened while she was on the throne. It's part of our history. Period. We start and stop right there.
Yeah, it is. And I'll side with the people that say it should stay as it is. But I do recall the first time I did a poll on this was back in 2007. And at that time, we found that 22% of Canadians felt that this was aptly named for a historical time. So that only, and even at that stage, under a quarter of the public really recognized it as more of a Queen Victoria Day than a 2-4 weekend. And so I can understand as we get generationally along, you know, people are going to say, well, why are we paying homage to something that was, you know, well, many, many years ago. But on the other hand, then you have a big debate about who's going to replace it. Like, you know, there's going to be a huge problem with all of that. I think personally, you just keep it where it is, educate people why it is, and you've got a statue at the front door of the legislature that actually, you know, commemorates her reign, and that's good enough for me anyways.
Well, and then it's just going to cause a whole stir. Then what do we do with Victoria Park, the street, Victoria Street downtown? I mean, what do we do about the mall, Victoria Terrace? I mean, that it really becomes the bigger issue. We're going to have to rename the mall if we don't recognize Victoria. All right, here we go. Colin, it has been almost week by week. The temperature shift at Queen's Park has been extraordinary, probably since, I would say, the end of March into the beginning of April. I mean, it was just, you know, your head on a swivel there. You couldn't keep up with where the government was going, where they were coming from, who was speaking with authority. A little bit of that this week when the premier kind of came out and said, oh, yeah, camps will be open in the summer. And everybody who was operating a summer camp said, we are? I mean, and then they were getting flooded by phone calls from parents. But that might have been the biggest misstep we've had this week. And that's, considering the missteps we've seen by the government in the past month or 6 weeks, that's a pretty good week.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you know, one of the things that the government has, I think, grown to realize that the person who makes the biggest missteps or, you know, accidentally causes the most amount of news by just saying something is the premier himself. And the best way to kind of stop that from happening is to just hide him, to just, you know, put him somewhere in some dusty office and just make sure that he doesn't get anywhere close to a microphone. I think the premier can't help himself. Like, when he hears information or he knows information, you know, he often is our best source. He often will be at the microphone and say something inadvertently and scoop his own announcement or scoop himself. I mean, a lot of times, you know, we find out that cabinet meetings are happening about very important decisions because the premier at the microphone would say as much. And I think he's kind of torn. On one hand, he wants to share a lot of information. He wants to keep people informed. And, you know, he famously said, you know, when I know it, you'll know it. And that ultimately became a bit of a problem as well because, you know, a lot of these times, the decisions hadn't really been made, and he was still hemming and hawing these decisions, like we saw with the school decision, right? Even yesterday, the premier saying out loud in public, in front of people, well, I've got some advice from some folks and some advice from other folks, and it's conflicting with one another. And I think he often ends up getting the government in more trouble than it's worth simply by being behind a microphone and saying stuff. So he's only been out in the last few weeks once a week. And I think that really has helped their cause because, you know, the focus isn't necessarily on what did Doug Ford say today. It's more on, you know, what is the government actually doing? And it's allowed them, given them the runway to actually be able to present, like we saw this week, a plan to get out of the pandemic that makes sense, that's built with benchmarks, that is clear and easy to understand, and isn't convoluted with multiple steps in all of this. It's just 1, 2, and 3. And so really it is telling, it should be telling to the progressive conservatives that when the premier gets out of the way, the government is allowed to actually get its work done.
Yeah, Keith, it's kind of an interesting dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, the premier, we were talking a couple of weeks ago about maybe, you know, a whole new definition of what it means to be a populist politician in this province. And clearly, you know, as Colin points out, the premier struggles with that.
Well, he does indeed, and he does want to, I think, honestly and sincerely inform people. As soon as he knows some good news, he wants to impart it. He wants to deliver that as much as he possibly can, and at times he does step on his own announcements, and times he steps on an announcement that's going to be made in a different way, and that's really where they look bad. The decision to keep him away, we used to taunt previous premiers when they would do this. I remember calling Dalton McGuinty Bubble Boy because they would try and protect him. This usually happens during a campaign when we would actually be paying to be on a bus to follow them, and we could rarely access them. And if we did, it'd be limited to 2 or 3 questions. So I think we're seeing this with Premier Ford now, a year out from the campaign, because the campaign manager is now in place and imposing some discipline on the Premier, the hardest one, I think, in the Conservative caucus to impose the discipline on. To Colin's point, keeping him on message and keeping him away from sending out the messages is key in this. I thought that he looked really strong, actually, on Thursday when he said, I am getting conflicting advice on the schools, but here's the bottom line. If we open June 2nd, there's going to be an 11% increase in deaths, going to be something like 1,000 a day instead of 500 new cases a day if we wait another 2 weeks. And he waited the 2. I was actually surprised because I know the pressure he's under. On the other hand, I still think there's a bit of dithering there. Why not just say it? See you in September. Let everybody plan what they need to know. They need to plan now. And of course, he started then playing politics with it as though pulling out the union stuff and saying that the unions, which we know that the unions in this government are never going to get along too well, but saying that they're threatening an injunction when the unions say that's not so. I mean, you're the government, as I think Graham Richards from CTV Ottawa pointed out yesterday, you're the one who open schools, open them if that's what you want to do. I think he made the right move, but I think he shouldn't have pulled the politics into it, blaming the unions again, not necessary.
John, when we looked at the reopening plan, and it's phased 3 stages, and by the time we kind of get to stage 3, we're somewhere around August. So it's a much different approach than we saw back in February when we were reopening on the verge of the 3rd wave. The thing that occurs to me is all of this is going to happen after the legislature rises for the summer. And so that what we're going to get is a shift in focus. People are going to be able to exhale, enjoy some of the summer, look forward to September, presumably kids back in classes because we're all going to have the vaccines, or, a good number of us. And I think it was really smart to actually attach these phases to vaccination rates, which is more positive rather than talking about ICU beds being overwhelmed or the number of cases, so that the numbers that we're really focusing on are something positive. It's taken them this long, but I think that works.
Well, it does, but it's only been in the last month that we've had true evidence that it actually is working out there. Again, go back to the National Health Service press conference in Britain. It's almost a month ago when they stood up and basically said that 2/3 1 jab, 1/4 2 jabs, and all of a sudden everything falls into place. So you're looking now at the province who's looking at 60%. Well, it was roughly 2/3 in England. So there are some benchmarks we've seen in the United States where we've gone from a month and a half ago, people still concerned that there's going to be variant outbreaks across the country, to a certain percentage who have been vaccinated and their hockey arenas are filled and everybody's cheering. So, I mean, I think settling on the science is a good thing. Number 2, taking it in 3 phases, much like Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, did. It's a workable plan. People get their headsets into it. But I also think the timing of it is really critical. I would want to be running out the clock to June. I would want to, just keep everything as steady as possible, keep Christine Elliott making more announcements than the Premier, having Dr. Williams occasionally out there, but, having it roll and then having some quiet. And I think you're absolutely right. People are going to want to get out. They're going to want to see the freedom because they are actually seeing it south of the border. But more importantly, the government needs time to reconstruct itself and start putting in the plans for the reopening of society. We've said that there are 3 phases to this. The first phase is the response phase. The next phase is the recovery phase. And the last phase is the reckoning phase, where, everybody looks back and says, what should have been done and what are we going to have to pay the price for? I think we're just at the doorstep of the recovery stage. And I think, there's certain other provinces that are still a month behind us, but we're all going to catch up within the next 30 to 60 days. And I think that's the next phase for this government is, what do you do now when things are settled down and you want to move society forward? And that's where you get business people involved and others to try and move it forward. So I think actually being out of the house and trying to put together those coalitions of movement will be the more important thing the government has to focus on.
Well, the reckoning is going to come, I think, Colin, in the form of the election campaign. And I'm already hearing from entrepreneurs and small business folks who it doesn't matter what Doug Ford does in the next 12 months. they have written him off. They are so fed up because they have seen whatever sector of retail or restaurants or hotels or gyms or barbershops that are just not going to survive the summer. Never mind, getting out and having a pint with folks on a patio is going to be our measure of success. They aren't going to be able to even serve the beer up. They are going to hold this government to account. So I think the reckoning might be a rather stormy affair for the premier. And to John's point in the last couple of weeks, is this the time where we begin to see the premier shuffling people around in the cabinet? The front bench has to look different when we come back in September. We're going to have to present, a new team of Avengers if we're going to be successful, considering the polls the way they are. They're in the hole.
I would suspect that, at the end of all of this, I know the cabinet ministers are tired. They're tired of fighting. They're tired of, just going through this pandemic. There have been some questions as to whether or not, the health minister would continue in her role. There was some suggestion that, even before this, that she didn't really want to run again. Now we're hearing that maybe she does again. I think the government needs to kind of reset the table, as it were, just to allow the electorate to kind of look at a new cabinet, right? Does the education minister need to stay there after all that he's been through, after all the controversy that he has incited himself? He doesn't even want to be there. That's what we hear pretty routinely, from people in Stephen Lecce's camp. And there are some really strong backbenchers who have become, a larger voice over the last number of months. People like Stan Cho, Prabmeet Sarkaria, David Piccini. These voices could be kind of vaulted into the front and have a new, fresh, younger face, because the progressive conservatives will need that kind of energy and youthfulness when it comes to the actual campaign. And keep in mind, some of the people who they've already had, like, Vic Fideli, Lisa McLeod, those guys, it's a question as to whether or not they're going to run again. They are all nominated. But, you can't rely on that old guard if you're looking to kind of reinvigorate the electorate and get them to be excited about you once again. You need those new, fresh faces. And I think doing a cabinet shuffle now wouldn't make sense because there's still a lot of risk between now and the end of the pandemic. Because we could see our case numbers go up again. Something could happen. The variants could go out of concern, and God forbid we have another lockdown. Well, you don't want to reset the cabinet and then have those new faces tainted with, all of this pandemic drama. You want to kind of be sure that you're out of it. And then you're right, maybe perhaps in August, maybe perhaps towards the tail end of July, give it that cabinet its fresh face. Remember, I believe it was July 29th that they reset the cabinet in 2019. So, 2 years out from that, that would be a good, time to kind of give it a new refresh. And as well, people will look at this as consequential. If you move the Minister of Long-Term Care, people will look at it as she's being fired or demoted. If you move the Minister of Education, it's the same thing. So I think they also have to be very careful in terms of not creating controversy out of a cabinet shuffle and present it in a way that's just saying, we just needed a fresh face here before the election, and this is what we chose to go with.
So, Keith, I wonder, to Colin's point, how, as they try to play this calculus, and you've noted they've already got the campaign manager in place. How much conversation is going on? Let's say, tapping, say, Vic Fideli on the shoulder and saying, Vic, it would be great if you decided that you weren't going to run. You make that announcement before the end of August so that at least we can start to move people around where it makes sense. Vic is stepping back, and I don't know that he is. I'm just saying that there's an example, but it might be that kind of backroom discussion that's going on to kind of give the, you can move the pieces of the puzzle around a little bit more deftly without, to Colin's point, making it look like somebody's getting fired or somebody's being demoted. I don't know how you avoid that, by the way, with Minister Fullerton or Minister Lecce, because it's just, there's a stink on that whole, both portfolios that they're not going to get away from. But I just wonder, you've been hanging around there a while. What do you think's going on?
Right now, they're all, if they haven't already, they're all being asked for a firm commitment, first of all. You're nominated. Are you actually going to run again? Because if you're not actually going to run again, we need to know, now, so that we can put a candidate in place, get someone, to win. I don't want to use Vic Fideli as the example because people think Vic has actually said so, and I don't think he has. But someone can run in that riding to replace them, get a candidate nominated for the party and give them a good year-long to build up a local base to cash in on it, the party's popularity there. But I think Colin's right. You know, it's something that might be done over the summer. But if you're not getting a commitment from someone, that's the best thing. If you could get someone like a Lecce to say, you know what, I really don't think I want to run again, then when you do put someone new into the education portfolio, you can say, it's because this minister isn't going to run again. Everyone gets that. You want a new minister in. Also, if you have time over the summer, if this is done over the summer, it gives the new ministers time to get up to speed on their files. That's the most important thing, because when they come into question period, as Colin says, all of a sudden, if there's a new long-term care minister, that minister is going to have to answer those questions. And if it's because Mary Lee Fullerton has been fired or demoted, that's going to be one of the top questions. They don't have to answer that type of question in the House, but that'll be the play on it. So if Ms. Fullerton is planning to, or Dr. Fullerton, excuse me, is planning to run again, it's going to be an issue for Premier Ford is to decide when and how, if he wants to move her out, because as Colin rightly points out, that's going to bring a lot of criticism. I want to say that that's an admission of failure on their part. But on the other hand, it might be time to make an admission that there was some serious problems in long-term care and we need a new face there, bottom line.
Yeah, John, that might just be one of the things where you just start a fire in that corner of the room, and then you can kind of carry on while everybody's trying to put the fire out. And if it is, for example, a minister that is already under fire and getting great criticism, it's not going to be much of a surprise. Maybe there is some political calculus that allows them to do that while they go back and kind of reset the stage out of sight.
I guess, but I always come back to the timing of when you do this. I mean, if they were to do it today, I'm sure there would be a lot of criticism, and the portrayal of guilt around what's happened. But if you're in the midst of July, no one cares. I mean, honestly, they're going to be more concerned about sitting on a patio and ordering a beer. There's going to be a one-day wonder where Colin and others, and Keith and you on the weekend have your moment of prayer on the whole thing, and then you're going to move on from it. The issue for the government is to look at it this way. Number one, despite all of this, the approval ratings of the Premier are still relatively okay. Right in the midst of all of the pandemic screaming and yelling that we experienced a month ago, his approval ratings had dropped, but they were still sitting at 35%. And in order to win a majority, you need about 37. So the approval ratings then were okay. And we were showing in the polling that we were doing then that 21% of people were still uncommitted. They didn't know exactly where they were going to end up. And in the 3 polls that have been released in the last couple of weeks, 20% are undecided. So you can look out a year from now and kind of go, at the end of the day, people are going to have a choice. He's actually in pretty good shape. If I were running the show, I'd say, look, July's a good time because it allows it. By that time, if everybody's vaccinated, as I said, I think we're going to be more concentrated, not on the issues of the day, but what's on the menu to order from the patio. And I think that's really the timing that the government's got to look at. And it's not all lost. They're okay.
Colin, what's going on on the other side of the legislature then? Because when you look at the polling numbers, saw seat projections. If we were looking at an election this week, you're probably looking at a minority conservative government. Andrea Horwath has a whole lot more power all of a sudden, with the NDP and the Liberals sort of neck and neck. What's the dynamic going on there on the opposition side?
Well, I think the opposition has made a few key calculations that long-term care, as an example, will be what gets them the female vote. I mean, they are really looking after the female vote here because, as one of their campaign strategists put it to me, they've never won an election or a minority or a government without having a very strong, dominant female vote. So that's really what they're courting here. And I think they do a lot of polling, and they sense that the government is on its hind foot. They sense that the government is a bit weaker, and a credit to the NDP because 40 seats, they will still say it's the second greatest showing, obviously since they formed government under Bob Rae. And while most of us might think that this might be the kind of the peak, the apex of their rise, the NDP believes that they will be able to form government next time. And so you've seen kind of Andrea Horwath, and this is kind of an interesting parallel that we've seen recently in the legislature. Premier Doug Ford recently has started to invoke Stephen Del Duca's name more often because obviously, he sees a challenger, he sees the polls. They know that, the Del Duca Liberals are now ahead of them in the polls. Whether that will last is another question. But recently, Andrea Horwath also started bringing in Stephen Del Duca's name into it. And so now she keeps saying, oh, Doug Ford and Del Duca, which I found to be a very interesting dynamic here. I mean, Del Duca obviously isn't actually a presence in the legislature because he doesn't have a seat, but his name comes up far more often than you would imagine. And that's because both the Progressive Conservatives and now the NDP have realized that he is now a player, or at least the Liberals are a player, because I think a lot of people, in any province, when they don't know where to go, left or right, they kind of park it in the middle. And that tends to be the Liberal Party. And so you can see the Progressive Conservatives are worried about, the gains that they made being lost back to the Liberals. You can see the NDP being worried about the gains that they made now going back to the Del Duca Liberals. And so their attacks are now focused back on the Liberals. And I just find that to be an interesting dynamic, albeit probably the natural way of things in our kind of very split legislature. The only person who isn't getting any dirt on him is Mike Schreiner, because nobody sees him as a threat, even though he's the most effective opposition leader in the entire Ontario legislature.
You know what? I think there's a great phrase in politics, and that is you should paint your own wagon before somebody else gets a chance to do so. And I think Mr. Del Duca has got to be very careful about where you start to head, because there is every possibility, even with a potential federal election, whenever that comes along, where the Conservatives in Ontario may start to paint him in a particular way. He's starting to put some policies out. We've seen that very recently. But I think the summer is also going to be a good time for him if, again, he can get out, like everybody's vaccinated and start walking around. They don't have really any money. They don't have the same grassroots infrastructure that the other parties have. But I think there's obviously going to be a chance to get him out where people can start going, hey, who is this person? And get to know him. So that is the risk, that the Liberals themselves have a great opportunity to present a new leader, contrast him with Mr. Ford, put some new policies down that cause people to reflect on that. But it's in the timing, because if you're not careful about that, just what you said, Colin, if you're hearing their names register in the legislature, and if you are seen as an incumbent threat, then you're going to get the gaze of the campaign management on both sides of those parties who say, okay, let's take this guy and let's paint him, as being the demon seed for sure.
All of this, these numbers in these recent polls, take me back to the most exciting times I ever covered at Queen's Park, which was 1985, when Frank Miller won that minority government, and the NDP and Liberals said, enough. 40 years is enough of Tory rule. We're going to defeat him in the legislature. And they didn't have a coalition government. They had that 2-year accord. The NDP laid out, here's what we want to do. And they made out, I forget how many points they wanted done. David Peterson said, and you'll make me premier? Sign here. And boom, that was done. So if they really want to prevent a second Ford term, and I'm convinced both the NDP and Liberals are united in that thought, they must already be looking behind the scenes at what could possibly come out of an accord or a coalition if Doug Ford is in a position to hold on to a minority and not a majority next June.
Well, somebody has to win the knife fight in the phone booth first, right? I mean, that's going to be what happens. If it's as you guys described, this is going to be close contact politics like we probably haven't seen in a long time.
I have to say that the one phrase that came out of this week, which was amusing to me, was that when they asked about when the plan's going to be put forward, someone chirped up and said, all in the fullness of time. And I went, oh my God, I'm back in 1981. I was like, where's the premier from Brampton? So it was a very interesting callback and a perfect phrase to use at the time.
What I think is going to be interesting, though, about the next election is whether Doug Ford's folksy charm and way of speaking is actually going to resonate. Because, through the pandemic, it's really funny. People both found it endearing, and then afterwards, especially during the third wave, have completely rejected this folksy way of talking, and it angers them. I mean, I spoke to the head of Ontario Soccer recently, and I happened to ask them. I said, "Hey, are your kids, after they play soccer, going out for pops, alcoholic or otherwise?" And the reaction that I got was a visceral anger, and they'd said, we have these pandemic plans in place. We didn't have cases last summer. We've worked really hard to ensure that people are safe, and for the premier to insinuate that people are going out and gathering and going to the locker room and having fun afterwards, is a slap in the face of a lot of these people. And so I wonder in the next election, because there is a stark contrast between the way Doug Ford communicates and Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath communicate. Andrea Horwath is very... she's very tied to her view of things, right? We've asked time and time again, hey, could you pay the government a compliment for, doing perhaps the right thing? And she never, ever, ever will. It's just kind of ingrained in her to just not give them any kind of, not even an inch. Del Duca is kind of a little bit different, but he will give the government some props from time to time. But he's also, you can tell that his lines are very workshopped. I mean, in fact, there was one point in which they used the word betrayal. And Doug Ford has betrayed Ontario. And I know for a fact that they workshopped that and they kind of, borrowed from, terminologies that you might see in the U.S. in terms of like Trump betraying the American people. And that's where they co-opted that line. And so he workshops his lines, and he's very, they are very careful in how they present information and how they present dialogue. And Doug is just, he just fires from the hip, right? Doesn't matter who's going to get shots, but he's just going to come in there and just say whatever, and whenever. So it's worked for him in the past. I wonder if it's going to work for him again, because throughout the pandemic, people have just kind of said, okay, buddy, we see through this. It's a lot of words. It's a lot of charm, folksiness, but there isn't a lot behind it. It really is an emperor with no clothes on. And so that's what I'm really kind of looking forward to see how that dynamic is going to play out on the campaign trail.
Yeah, which Doug Ford actually is going to show up to, because he talk about being in a knife fight. I mean, he's a formidable politician at close range. So, Colin, it's always great to have you. Thanks for joining us, and happy Victoria Day.
Thank you. Happy long weekend.
And that'll do it for us with John Wright and Keith Leslie. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast. It's an eye contact podcast.